illustrious family of the state, the budding cardiothoracic and vascular surgeon was by the cruel mandate of destiny snatched from our midst at the prime of his life on the 10th of September 2003 at the tender age of 33 years. A versatile and a multifaceted self, besides being a loving son to Sri Dhiresh Narayan Chaudhary and Srimati Biraja Chaudhary, he was an adorable elder brother to his siblings, Arunab and Barnali, and a warm and a human being to all. Always wearing a beaming smile, he in his brief earthly stint was an embodiment of affectionate warmth and selfless humanism for all fellow beings, more particularly the last, lost, and the lowliest. This loving soul endeared himself to all who came in touch with him, and he lit their lives with his inspirational radiance. As his name features, he was amiable, matured, intelligent, truthful, affable, benign, humble, and that's Amitabh. Service above self was his life's motto and mission. He believed in universal human oneness. Masses in misery moved him. He personified Annie Besant's verse, O hidden life, vibrant in every atom, O hidden lights, shining in every creature, O hidden love, embracing all in oneness. May all who feel themselves as one of thee know they are also one with every other. On this day, ladies and gentlemen, we not only remember him fondly, but earnestly endeavor as well to live his values, principles, emotions, dreams, vision, and above all, his abiding concern for the have-nots. Ladies and gentlemen, we wish him a very happy birthday today and pray to the Almighty to nestle him in his loving arms. The trust to commemorate the virtuous qualities of Amitabh and as a tribute to his memory and his spirit of service to humanity decided to pursue his vision and through philanthropic initiatives has meanwhile undertaken many projects to infuse and enliven humanism and institutionalize fellowship and practice humanity. It is in furtherance of its mission to stimulate and nurture human unity and more importantly to pursue Amitabh's yearning for achieving excellence in all spheres of life by acquainting every segment of the society with various contemporaneous issues of societal importance that the Trust has initiated a lecture series since 19th of December 2004, which has since then been an annual feature. Over the years, after the lecture series was inaugurated by none other than late Revered Honorable Mr. Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer, there has been an impressive array of themes of overwhelming societal relevance encompassing law, history, science, religion, economics, environment, governance, society, et al., with distinguished speakers gracing the events with erudite eloquence. The Trust is sincerely thankful to each one of you for the continuous abiding support of yours in all its modest endeavors to pursue Amitabh's vision, without which it would not have been possible to undertake the journey this far. We fervently appeal to you all to continue to provide your unstinted cooperation and support in future as well, so that the Trust can pursue its salutary mission. Ladies and gentlemen, today's speaker, Dr. Bhanu Pratap Mehta, former Vice-Chancellor, Ashoka University, needs no introduction. Apart from academically decorated credentials to his credit, he has meanwhile held numerous prestigious positions and is a recipient of many coveted awards. He is a prolific writer and a vibrant presence in contemporary times. His address today is titled India's Second Republic, the Collapse of Liberal Constitutionalism. Ladies and gentlemen, we now present to you Dr. Bhanu Pratap Mehta with a request to him to kindly deliver the memorial lecture. Thank you all.
It's a great honor and great privilege to be able to deliver the 17th Dr. Amitabh Chaudhary Memorial Lecture. It's a sobering thought that he would have been 50 today. And I must confess, it's a very intimidating occasion and a solemn one as well. By all accounts, Dr. Chaudhary was an exceptional human being who embodied extraordinary intelligence, humanitarian values, a generosity of spirit, and as his sister Barnali described it, a spirit of sweetness and light, something I think we could all have used on this occasion. It's also a reminder that death has many faces, but it has only one irrevocable truth. It represents the loss of a unique individual. And honestly speaking, whenever we see occasions like this, I think we have to remember that there is no consolation for the loss of a person like Amitabh. There is no theological comfort, no religious solace, no philosophy can make up for that loss. But what the Chaudhary family has done through the Amitabh Chaudhary Memorial Trust and all its trustees, right, is make sure that the spirit of Dr. Amitabh Chaudhary lives on in its fullest amplitude through the various activities of the trust, which include, in some ways, making sure that people's lives are not needlessly wasted. So our salutations to the family, to the trust, for creating an extraordinary monument, I think, in Dr. Amitabh Chaudhary's memorial lecture. My topic today is abstract, but hopefully it is a theme which Dr. Amitabh Chaudhary would have approved of, because it is a theme that speaks to, I think, the future of India. Something presumably someone like him would have cared about. My topic is not a cheery one. It is about the collapse of liberal constitutionalism in India, right? And what it means for the future of our republic. Right? Liberal constitutionalism, and I'll just define it in a second, in India has always been considered something that lives on fragile ground, a topsoil with shallow roots. But for all of India's problems, the progressive pathway laid down by our constitution was clear to most of its citizens. It was to emancipate individuals, to endow them with the maximum freedom possible, compatible with a similar freedom for others, to provide the material basis for social self-respect, and to create a new form of solidarity based in human fraternity. But the political developments and the constitutional developments of the last few years have, in some senses, for the first time since independence, in a serious sense, 1975, of course, was another occasion. But for the first time since independence, there is now a serious question mark over the viability of this project. And the constitutional developments around us signal a near collapse of this project. And it is this collapse that I want to reflect on and outline today. No one knows the constitutional law better than the Honorable Justice, and most of you citizens who might be listening to this. In our classrooms, we teach constitutional law. We all know constitutions often need to be interpreted. They are sometimes internally inconsistent, catering to incompatible values or expediency or political compromises. There is sometimes an internal tension within a constitution between group values and individual values. But we all know constitutions provide a public articulation of our commonly shared values. They provide rules and values we take for granted, protections we can rely on, and normative goals we all share. Let me put the matter as bluntly as I can. Today, if somebody were to ask a teacher of constitutional law, do you know what the Constitution of India is anymore? Do you know what protections can be taken for granted? Can you take habeas corpus for granted, for example? Can anyone predict with any degree of certainty what the formal allocation of powers in our system of government between legislature, executive, judiciary, between the center and the states is going to be? Right? What is the role of the judiciary? What answer do we give to such a student? And I must confess, frankly, these days when I walk into discussions on constitutional law, I begin by saying I have no idea what Indian constitutional law is anymore. Okay? There are some exceptional judges in our judicial system, high courts valiantly soldiering on, trying to protect the basic spirit of that constitution, that freedom, equality, fraternity that I had just outlined. But the overall picture is quite bleak and quite grim. Let us just look at the basic ways in which our constitutional identity has collapsed. In 1950, India's constitution gave India a new identity, an old civilization forming itself on the basis of a new social contract. The preamble to the Indian Constitution, which many citizens have been reading over the course of the last year, is an extraordinary, spare and elegant preamble. And you know what makes it spare and elegant? Is the fact that it does not burden citizens with either God, history, or identity. Its pulsating heart and unredeemed promise is liberty, equality, fraternity, and justice. Unlike the preambles of many constitutions that will begin with a reference to a God, that will begin reference to a particular historical identity, right, burdening you with the weight of the past, our constitution was meant to set us free. This is not because God is not important or may not be important for people. This is not because we don't have identities. This is not because we don't have a rich and deep history. But the Constitution's beauty was to say, New India is free to imagine God, history, and identity in whichever way it chooses. Okay? It actually took these things so seriously that in a sense it guaranteed all the freedoms that made the imagining of these identities possible. Like a little stroth, the preamble lets you concentrate on the basics. Liberty for what, equality of what, and fraternity between whom. The three basic questions of constitutionalism. Right? And it says that the answer to any one of these questions depends on the answer to the others. One concept, liberty, cannot be operational without equality, and neither can be operational without fraternity. The other thing you might notice about the Constitution, and I think something a doctor like Dr. Amitabh Chaudhary would have genuinely cared about, is that apart from references to justice and the unity of the nation, the references are in the preamble are all to the dignity of the individual. This is a very radical idea in the Indian context. Our discourse on communal solidarity in these troubled times often invokes the idea of solidarity between groups across different identities, religious, caste, and so forth. But the preamble to the Indian Constitution was referring to something more radical. The unity of a nation is not simply the solidarity of groups. It is based on a real and much deeper unity that is possible only when the dignity of every single individual is assured. The preamble was saying to us, if you honor the freedom and dignity of every individual, the nation has nothing to fear. Right? Automatically becomes united. So the preamble to our constitution was a charter of liberation centered on the dignity of the individual. It envisaged a unity, but it was not the unity of sameness. It was the unity of something more difficult. It was the unity of reciprocity, that we care for each other, not that we are the same. Of honoring, as it were, our mutual obligations to each other, not collapsing us into the same identity. And it is this project, I would like to humbly submit, that is all but collapsing before our eyes. Why do I say this? Again, to put the matter a little bit bluntly, these are important matters. One can be graceful about them, but when important matters are at stake, perhaps one can take a few liberties and be a little graceless. India is fast moving towards becoming a Hindu majoritarian nation. This claim, right, you might say, of an ethnocracy is being inscribed in our politics in more ways than one can list. The dominant political narrative in our electoral politics, in our civil society, is that minorities in India had too much power. They had a veto over reform. They had a veto over affairs affecting the nation. Now we will, in some senses, make them irrelevant. Right? The claim that they had a veto is, of course, an exaggerated claim. But the claim that minorities can be made irrelevant to politics, right, is perhaps even more dangerous. The Indian Constitution promised to unburden you. You are free to be whoever you want to be. You are always more than any single identity can capture. You can always be different from who you are. This ideal has been replaced by the ideal of an empowered ethnocracy. What do we mean by an empowered ethnocracy? It's an empowered ethnocracy in the sense that power is still legitimized through electoral democracy, and there is no question that electoral democracy still remains, you might say, a civic religion in India, right? The sole means through which we legitimize political power. But this electoral democracy is increasingly becoming an ethnocracy. The identity of the nation is being defined in Hindu terms. Jawaharlal Nehru, remember, had defined India as a palimpsest on which every civilization has written in its history, right? India is a Hindu country, Muslim country, Christian country, Parsi country, Sikh country. India is an Asian power. The Indian Constitution represents the best of the European Enlightenment, right? Its greatness, right, what made it an extraordinarily unique political experiment in the world, right, was the fact that it took everything in the world and made it its own. This idea of India as a palimpsest no longer commands political credibility. Instead of this palimpsest in which the whole world can find its place. We talk of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam a lot, but India was actually the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam in that literal sense, right? The one nation in the world, right, on whom every civilization, in a sense, had inscribed its mark, right? This is no longer a source of pride for us. This is a source of embarrassment. This is a source of fear. This is a source of conflict. Religious identities are being increasingly used as the basis of granting citizenship status. I realize the Citizenship Amendment Act and the attendant NRC has a different history and different politics in the state of Assam. But the way that politics, in a sense, has been applied nationally, you cannot but draw the conclusion that religious categories are being inscribed into our imagination of citizenship itself. We have a new law in the state of Uttar Pradesh, without embarrassment being called the love jihad law, right? This law is a double travesty on our constitution. It denies, in some significant sense, the freedom of religion. And it says to every ordinary citizen, even an act of love has to be authorized and stamped by a state through its communal prism. I hope the Supreme Court strikes it down, but the law exists. Our articulation of Indian history. Yes, I'd be the first to admit there have been versions of Indian history that have sought to erase conflicts of the past away, that have sought to sometimes paint medieval India as this rosy, seamless synthesis, which it wasn't. I mean, all history is full of conflicts of all kinds, right? But the narrative, right, articulated in some senses at the highest levels of government, that the way in which one should view Indian history is as a history of 1,000-year subjugation, right, has no other aim but to, in a sense, expunge India's diversity, right? It's a kind of revolt against that Nehruvian idea of the palimpsest that I talked about. Lynching had become normalized for a while. Cow protection and the empowering of vigilantism in the name of cow protection, as you're seeing in the latest bill introduced in the Karnataka Assembly. The list could go on and on. It almost feels, if you read the newspaper these days, as if you're reading a newspaper from the 1930s India. We are arguing about the same issues over and over again. So, we are being burdened with this identity, right? The very thing the Constitution sought to emancipate us from. But there is more. This is, you might say, just a political, cultural articulation. Look at, in some senses, what is happening to the institutions of the state. I would like to submit, to be a little bit provocative, that it's the first time since India's independence that India is facing the twin challenge of communalism and authoritarianism together. We've always had communalism in Indian politics. Dividing people on communal lines is a time-honored electoral tradition. We've had periods of authoritarianism in 1975, in particular during the emergency. But the idea that a regime could be justified by fusing the two together is a relatively novel phenomenon. Think of the 10 ways, right, 10 markers of growing authoritarianism in India. First marker is the use of what we in political scientists call ethnic dog whistles. Right? What are ethnic dog whistles? It is when politicians overtly or covertly signal that certain communities' standing, the standing of particular individuals belonging to particular communities, be impugned simply because of who they are. Look at the protesters, what dress they were wearing. I don't need to remind you who said this during the CAA protests, but that's a dog whistle, right? You're supposed to judge people, their political intentions, their motives, right, by the dress they are wearing. So, ethnic dog whistles have become normalized in Indian politics. Frankly, almost the way in which they were normalized in 1930s Weimar Germany. The second marker of authoritarianism, dissent is treason. Any democracy, and particularly a fractious democracy like India, will have periods of deep contestation, right? Argument, sometimes street protests. Right? But what is novel now about this political moment is that the very act of expressing dissent in all its forms, almost all its forms, is becoming an act of treason. You will be charged under UAPA, not under Unlawful Prevention Activities Prevention Act, not under any normal law. Whether or not you'll be granted bail, right? A jurisprudence which we used to take almost for granted, depends on, right, how your standing is constructed as it were, a figure of treason. In almost all the recent protests that we have seen in India, whether it was the CA protests, anti-CA protests, whether it was the Bhima Koregaon protests, whether it is the current farmers' agitation in Punjab, there are 4 tropes that have become normalized. The protest is almost always public. You can disagree with it. Many of those protests have, on occasion, crossed a line that some people might object to. But the government is always determined to prove that behind this protest there is a secret conspiracy. Right? It doesn't matter if the protesters were carrying pictures of Ambedkar or Gandhi, or were reading the preamble of the Indian Constitution. The government almost always alleges that the public avowal of these constitutional values marks the fact that there are secret conspirators behind this protest. This is what the intelligence agencies keep telling us. Right? It keeps telling us that in some senses any form of dissent or protest almost always ends up in a conspiracy to violence. There is no higher rule here but a propensity to violence. It always presents any form of dissent as the expression of a self-chosen vanguard, professional dissenters who show up everywhere. But the net result is very simple. The net result is dissent has become an act of treason. There are human rights lawyers in jail. There are intellectuals in jail. Right? That's the second. Ethnic dog whistles. The construction of dissent as treason. The third feature of authoritarianism is control of the information order. Right? This is done through a variety of means. It's no news to most of the audience listening to this that the Indian media, particularly television media, is a very tightly controlled media structure. And the irony is you don't even have to declare formal emergency to control it. Trust me, if the state wants to send a signal to any media house, right, that it wants to influence its content, that it wants to take certain stories off the front page or off the screens, it can now do that more effectively than it has ever done so in the past. Right? Most Indian television media, as many of you know, actually doesn't earn profits. People often say that, the media is shaped by TRP. Actually, I wish the media was shaped by a genuine response to citizens' preferences. This is a supply-side media, created by a nexus of capital and politics, right, that allows for the control of an information order to an unprecedented degree. Right? For those of us who write, for those of us who have colleagues who work in the media, it's never been a more hazardous time. But there are other ways of controlling the information order as well. There's censorship, there's indirect influence, but there are also campaigns of disinformation. Right? And the campaigns of disinformation work on one very simple principle. To cast doubt on the credibility of someone, all you have to do, right, is raise questions about them. You just have to raise the finger of suspicion, and their credibility is in some senses impugned. There is this asymmetry, you might say, between truth and doubt, right? Truth requires evidence. Doubt doesn't require evidence, right? It just requires, in a sense, a psychological manipulation. Okay. So we are in an information order where sifting through the truth, which stories get coverage, which don't, is no longer something we can take for granted. That central pillar of democracy, government by discussion, is fading in this respect. The fourth feature of an increasingly authoritarian turn is ruling dispensations everywhere, empowering vigilantes to either take the law into their own hands or to, in some senses, perform the function of law. One of the characteristics of our times, if you look at a state like UP, if you look at a state like Karnataka, is that there is a wide variety of groups, Bajrang Dal, right? Hindu Yuvak Sena, just to name a couple. Maybe you could argue PFI on the other side in some instances, who get state protection and patronage. The reward for political vigilantism is high. You just have to look at the kinds of people who are getting tickets to parliament, right? So the state does not only govern through the formal arm of the law or the formal structure of state institutions. It deploys a whole panoply of civil society organizations to, in some senses, control the information order and keep it in check. You can add more features to this list. One of the most disquieting trends of our time is that if you look at most of the reforms that the state has undertaken in relation to the citizens, they have been attuned to making citizens more transparent to the state, but making the state more opaque to the individuals. Okay? In 2004, for example, post-2004, India passed the Freedom of the Right to Information Act, a historic piece of legislation, right, that for the first time empowered the citizenry to ask questions of government in a way in which was not possible before. The Right to Information Act has been slowly and quietly gutted, right? Take an institution like electoral bonds. Political finance has always been murky in India. It's one of the signal failures of Indian democracy. But surely the trend line should have been to make political funding more transparent, not less. The institution of electoral bonds, the clean chit to political parties in accepting FCRA money, while legitimate NGOs are being threatened. Right? The rise of the surveillance state, right? In all its different forms. All of these cumulatively amount to a situation where the state is saying to the citizens, all of you should be 100% transparent to us. We should know what you breathe, what you think, what you spend, how you spend it. But the state itself becomes less and less transparent. Right? It's a radical shift in our direction, of direction. This is then buttressed by the fact that the most important independent institutions that safeguard our liberties, that are supposed to be custodians of the Constitution, are either being seriously undermined or have undermined themselves. Take the judiciary, for example, an extraordinary institution, right, that particularly since the emergency, post-emergency, at various points came to the defense of the Indian Constitution, right, kept its promises alive against the arbitrary use of executive power. Not perfectly, not as much as some of us would have liked, right? But at least it was a locus of hope. There are still judges, there are still high courts passing extraordinarily brave orders, extraordinarily constitutionally correct orders. And yet, it has to be said, even at the risk of sounding somewhat graceless, that if you look at the overall framework that the Supreme Court has provided over the last few years, it's becoming increasingly clear that the application of constitutional law, that's what I'm talking about in particular, has become dependent on the arbitrary whims of individual judges. So much so that constitutional terms no longer have any meaning. The law quite happily connives in being an instrument of oppression, or at the very least aids and abets oppression. What does this mean in practice? In practice, it means very weak protection for civil liberties, an unusual degree of deference to state power, especially in constitutional matters. And of late, the court has also become excessively concerned with its own lese majesty. Like a sacred monarch, it cannot be seriously criticized or mocked. Right? Politics, Indian politics, as I said, by constructing the dissenter as treasonous, as seditious, had already injected a poison into our politics. But the framework of laws that enables this, where the purpose of politics is no longer equal justice for all, it is to convert politics into a game of victims and oppressors and ensure that all your side comes up the winner. This is a game that is largely now being abetted, at least, by most of our independent institutions. Okay? What about other sources of resistance, you might say, right? Well, what about Indian capital? Let's face it, there is a saying, he or she who allocates capital allocates power in a society. You don't have to be a Marxist to believe that, right? Look at what has happened to Indian capital over the last 10 years. Most private entrepreneurs are scared of speaking frankly in public. But leave that aside. Let's look at the objective facts. Indian capital is much more concentrated. Right? There's a much greater concentration of capital and power over the last 5 to 10 years than there has been in the last 20. Right? So very high capital concentration. There is a political style that favors permanent mobilization. Right? Every 3 months we will discover a new dissenter, a new enemy, right? Against whom we define this collective Indian project. There is a politics of Vishwas, right? Politics of faith, as it were, characterized by an increasing bellicosity and almost disinhibition of political style. Almost anybody is free to say anything, so long as you're picking out the right enemies. If you add up all of these characteristics, and I'll be the first to admit, these are not entirely novel in Indian politics. There have been shades of these in the past. But the fact that all of them have come together in a mutually reinforcing complex, right, is, as it were, almost a new and unprecedented phenomenon in our constitutional history. And it's not going to be something that's easy to dislodge or easy to repair. You must ask the question, why did this happen, right? Have the beliefs of Indian citizens, has the nature of Indian citizenry changed so dramatically over the last 10, 15 years? Is this no longer the India that we thought was going to be the locus of progressive emancipatory hopes. This is a very deep and profound question, and I must confess, I don't think we fully have the answers to this question. Right? Many of the tendencies that I'm describing were latent in Indian democracy. But I think 5 things have made this possible, and this is sort of what I want to kind of close out with. One, we have to admit that this old order that we talk about, right, collapsed of its own weight. There is no question that by the time you had come to the 2009 financial crisis, India's old political order had run its course. It had become a plutocracy, I'd be the first to admit. Right? You just have to look at the continuing nature of our banking crisis to recognize just how deep a plutocracy India had become. The Congress party has no fight, no imagination, right? No consistency of purpose, and frankly, no adherence of principle left to it. We can't turn to it as a source of principles, right? The second thing that happened, I think, simultaneously, is we always used to think in India that power can never be concentrated in the way that I just described, beyond a point, because India is too large a country. And it has so many cross-cutting cleavages of religion, of caste, of region, that anybody who tries to concentrate power in the way that I just described, where executive power, informational power, ideational power, economic power is concentrated. But there have been profound changes underway in Indian society that electorally make those differences unable to check this concentration of power. The most significant change can be described in the following ways. Right? The 3 biggest sources of resistance to the concentration of power in India, whether you like these sources or not is another matter. This is just a descriptive political science analysis, right? The 3 biggest sources used to be, one was region, right? Indian federalism was promised on the foundations of regional linguistic diversity. Right? The second was caste. We always used to think, in fact, we used to say, Kamandal versus Mandal. Now, neither of those terms are very happy terms for Indian politics. But at least in the political process, there was always an assumption that both would check each other. Right? But one of the most interesting and startling things I think that has happened to Indian politics is that the logic of region and caste, which used to be an agglomerative logic against centralizing power, right? So think of, for example, post-Mandal politics in North India. Think of the rise of the BSP in North India, right? Where you were in a sense consolidating lots of jatis into a larger political movement. Think of the Dravidian movement in South India, right? The logic of these movements was an agglomerative logic. They were able to mobilize sufficient numbers of people, right, to actually become viable political forces in their own right. Albeit at a limited level, with limited imagination, right, with a limited agenda, but they were a kind of natural break. This logic no longer holds true in Indian politics. And in some ways, it's a good thing, to be honest. Right? It no longer holds true, number one, because the language question has largely been neutralized for the most part, unless the BJP rakes up the question of imposing Hindi again. The language question is not going to be a source of major resistance to it. It's been neutralized in some ways. But the caste logic, because of the internal differentiation between these groups, has now become a de-agglomerative logic. You're actually not getting caste-based movements asking for more and more groups to join together in an emancipatory agenda. You're actually, in a sense, getting the breakdown of caste-based social movements into smaller and smaller units. Right? And the BJP has absolutely been brilliant at politically exploiting this opportunity. So this sociological determinism we all used to work with, India is too diverse, right? Too many cross-cutting cleavages for power to be ever centralized. Actually, in a sense, no longer holds true. The third thing that I think has changed, and this I do want to say with some trepidation, but it has to be said, I think Indian capitalism's investment in the Hindutva project has become much more pronounced. The kind of material resources, control of the information order that it takes to produce the kind of political project that Hindutva is, a kind of desecration of our constitutional values, right, has broadly got the support of India's most powerful and privileged. Okay. This is the way in which how much resonance Hindutva has in mass politics is still, I think, an open and contestable question. Okay. But I think this group, Indian capital broadly speaking, India's upper middle classes broadly speaking, right, they have a peculiar dilemma. You know, when India was growing at 8%, let's say the period between 2000 2008, we could sell a legitimizing story to the country. India grows at 8%. Yes, it will be unequal growth, but it will generate enough resources, right, to redeem at least some of the promise of our constitution. What do you do when growth plummets? The new National Family Health Survey is just out. For the first time in 10 years, India's malnutrition rate is increasing, not decreasing. For the first time in almost 30 years, right, fewer people will come out of poverty every year. So what is the legitimizing narrative we spin? Right? We do not have that shared economic prosperity on which to construct a coalition of fraternity. We, in a sense, turn to religious nationalism. The international environment certainly helped, where a certain kind of ethnic nationalism became much more internationally acceptable, or at least there was no penalty in engaging with it. What can counter these trends? I said that would require a full seminar and so forth. But what I hope I've at least managed to convince you about is the fact that the Indian liberal constitutional project is in serious crisis. And this is a systemic crisis. This is not about a lapse here or there. We've always had those lapses. This is not about an odd state government here or there. Right? It embodies those 10 features that I just listed as constituting aspects of India's authoritarian crisis in a cycle that has now become mutually reinforcing. Okay? It's not going to be easy to break out of this cycle. The electoral dynamics are not propitious. It has to be said, no matter where you stand on the political spectrum, the BJP is an extraordinary electoral machine, right? And the Congress is, in a sense, writing itself into existence. Creating new political parties is not easy. Creating new social movements is not easy. It's a 10 to 15 year, in some senses, struggle at least to even get a foothold. So unless we treat this crisis in the same way as which the nationalist generation treated the crisis of colonialism, namely what we require is almost a second freedom struggle, right? With all the kinds of solidarities that it requires. Our constitutional order, if we meet 10 years from now, 15 years from now, and we say, what kind of a constitution India has, we will be saying, not that India is a liberal democracy, we will be saying India is an authoritarian ethnocracy. Right? That's a very, very sobering thought. I don't think Dr. Amitabh Chaudhary would have liked to grow in a world like that. Right? And so we have to renew, I think, that constitutional faith almost as a second freedom struggle. And this will mean public articulation, the creation of new solidarities, occasionally even public protest. We should remember these words of Frederick Douglass. He says, "Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are people who without plowing the ground. They want rain without the thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the roar of its many waters. The struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both. But there will have to be a struggle." Why? Because remember, he said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. And at the Constitution seems so powerless, right? It seems like words on paper. We will have to demand more of ourselves and more of each other. Thank you.
যদিহে মাত কথাত কেশৰ উৎসাহ হৃদয়ত তেন্তে ইণ্ডিয়াই খেলিব নিজৰ ষ্টাইলত বিমল কক ভাষা কেশৰী
ৰাচন শেষ হৈ গ'ল মাৰ্কেটলৈ
তুমি অকলেই যোৱা
কাইলৈ পেৰেণ্ট টিচাৰ মিটিং আছে
তুমি অকলেই যোৱা না
50 সুইট ভাল নহয় নে
আৰে এইটোতো সিংগল মানুহৰ চাই
অকলেই সকলো কাম কৰো যদি সিংগলে হয় নহয় 50 salty Britannia 50-50 all of 50-50 হওক লাইফ 10-10-10 তই পিন্ধিছা নাইস তোৰ ময়শ্চাৰাইজাৰে সোনকালে ছুটি লৈ ললে প্ৰথমে এইটো লগা শীতকালত ট্ৰাই কৰক ইণ্ডিয়াৰ নম্বৰ 1 বডি লোশন ভ্যাসলিন ইয়াৰ গ্লিচাৰিন যুক্ত ফৰ্মুলাই গভীৰলৈকে আৰ্দ্ৰতা যাচে আৰু ভ্যাসলিন জেলিয়ে আৰ্দ্ৰতা লক কৰে যাতে আপুনি পায় কোমল মুলায়ম ছাল গোটেই দিন ভ্যাসলিন
মা পেইন্ট ওভার মা সস ওভার মা ফুটবল ওভার
মাহটো ধৰি তোমালোকৰ পাউডাৰ কিমান ওভাৰ হয় বাৰু
আধা কিলো সার্ফ এক্সেলো নট ওভার আগতে সাধাৰণ পাউডাৰ 1 কিলো লাগিছিল ইয়াৰ মাত্ৰ আধা লাগে আৰু মাহটোতকৈ বেছি চলে সার্ফ এক্সেল ইজি ওয়াশ গাড়ীতে থাকা কি কৰিছা
দেউতাক দেখিছিলো
তুমি কেতিয়া ইমান ডাঙৰ হৈ গলা হৰলিক্স গাখীৰ ঘেঁহু ভিটামিনছ
The Navy gives me confidence.
The Navy gives me courage.
The Navy gives me a career.
The Navy gives you more. Indian Navy, an ocean of opportunities.
লকডাউন নিসংগভাৱে কটাই বুজিলো নিসংগতাত কিমান দিন যে জীয়াই আছিলো এফালে আছিল আনে কি কব তাৰ ভয় শংকা আনফালে পুনৰ জীয়াই থকাৰ দুৰ্বাৰ আশা সেয়ে যেতিয়া ঘৰৰ পৰা ওলাবলৈ পালো সন্মতি মই নিজৰ ভয়ৰ পৰা নিজকে মুকলাবলৈও দিলো অনুমতি।
নতুন এক স্বাধীনতাৰ আনন্দ উৎসৱ পাতক, স্মাইল কৰক আৰু আৰম্ভ কৰি দিয়ক কোলগেট।
সাধাৰণ চিমেণ্টে এটা এয়াৰ ষ্ট্ৰিপ তৈয়াৰ কৰোঁতে লয় 28 দিন, ই লয় কেৱল 4 দিন। এয়া হ'ল ভৱিষ্যতৰ প্ৰযুক্তি, যাক আজি আমাৰ ওচৰলৈ লৈ আনিছে ডালমিয়া চিমেণ্টে। আৰু মই মোৰ ঘৰ বনাই আছো এই চিমেণ্টেৰে।
Dalmia Cement. Future today.
গম পালো এসপ্তাহো নাই হোৱা।
যদিহে আদৰ যত্ন প্ৰথম দিনটোৰ পৰাই, তেন্তে সঠিক পুষ্টিও প্ৰথম দিনটোৰ পৰাই।
সেয়ে মাদাৰ্ছ হলিক্স, যাৰ নতুন চিনাকি হ'ল হলিক্স মাদাৰ্ছ প্লাছ। ইয়াত আছে 25 বিধ ভাইটেল নিউট্ৰিয়েণ্টছ, DHA, যি ব্ৰেইন ডেভেলপমেণ্টত সহায় কৰে, আৰু প্ৰটিন হেল্থি বাৰ্থ ৱেইটৰ বাবে। হলিক্স মাদাৰ্ছ প্লাছ।
এনে লিকতা দাগ আপোনাৰ বাজেটতে গুচাবৰ বাবে আগবঢ়োৱা হৈছে নতুন এৰিয়েল পাৰফেক্ট ৱাছ, পাৰফেক্ট প্ৰাইচত। ই সাধাৰণ পাউডাৰৰ তুলনাত লিকতা দাগ গুচাই মাত্ৰ এবাৰ ৱাছতে।
ময়শ্চাৰাইজ স্কিনতকৈ বাৰু বেছি ভাল কি হ'ব পাৰে? বাউন্সি স্কিন। আহক জানি লওঁ এই বেলুনবোৰৰ পৰা। এয়া হ'ল ময়শ্চাৰাইজ স্কিন, আৰু এয়া হ'ল এনে স্কিন যি ময়শ্চাৰাইজ আৰু বাউন্সিও। নতুন ডাভ সাপল বাউন্স বডি লোশন। ইয়াৰ নিউট্ৰিডিঅ ফৰ্মুলাই ছাললৈ কেৱল আৰ্দ্ৰতা যচাই নহয়, লগতে ছাল কৰি তোলে ছফ্ট আৰু বাউন্সিও। নতুন ডাভ সাপল বাউন্স বডি লোশন।
মই ব্যৱহাৰ কৰোঁ আটাইতকৈ সবল আৰু সতেজ চিমেণ্ট, সূৰ্যা চিমেণ্ট। সূৰ্যা চিমেণ্ট, অটুট ঘৰ, অটুট অসম।
দুগুণ বেছি ভলিউম আৰু বাউন্স থকা চুলি লাগে? ট্ৰাই কৰক সানসিল্ক ভলিউম শ্যাম্পু। ইয়াত আছে কোকোনাট ৱাটাৰ আৰু এল'ভেৰা। ই চেপেটা চুলিলৈ যাছে দুগুণ বেছি ভলিউম আৰু বাউন্স। নেচাৰেল ভলিউম আৰু বাউন্সৰ বাবে সানসিল্ক ভলিউম শ্যাম্পু। নতুন সানসিল্ক স্মুথনেছ শ্যাম্পু। ইয়াত আছে হানি আৰু আমণ্ড। ই দিয়ে 2x লৈকে বেছি স্মুথ নেচাৰেল চুলি। কি হ'ল বাইদেউ?
বাছ ভাবিছিলো ড্ৰয়িং ৰুমৰ লুক সলাওঁ।
আৰু পিঠিয়ে চৰি বছ কৈ দিলে। পিঠিয়ে আপোনাৰ কথা তেতিয়া শুনিব যেতিয়া আপুনি ইয়াৰ কথা শুনিব। জানেনে 30ৰ পিছত বোন ডেন্সিটি কমি যাব পাৰে। বাছি লওক উইমেন্স হৰলিক্স, যাৰ নতুন চিনাকি হ'ল হৰলিক্স উইমেন্স প্লাছ। ই দিয়ে 100% ডেইলি কেলচিয়াম আৰু ভাইটামিন ডি, যি বোন ষ্ট্ৰেংথক লক কৰাত সহায় কৰে। যদিহে হৃদয়ৰ কথা শুনে, দি হেভ টু ষ্টেণ্ড ষ্ট্ৰং।